to tell you a little bit about the background of why there's cards and the whole, idea and genesis behind the fact that I've been doing this for a number of years right now. And it started in 1994 when some friends of mine and I got together we were all California artists at the time. We got together and decided to start something called Sunday Painting, where every Sunday we'd do a painting, one a week, and at the end of the year we'd get together and have an exhibition of our best paintings. So I had a deck of cards with me at the time, and I said, well, there's 52 cards in a deck and 52 Sundays in a year. I'm going to blindfold myself and draw one of these cards from the deck every Sunday for a year. And I grew up as a little girl in Washington, D.C., going to the National Portrait Gallery. And at the time, the National Portrait Gallery did not have a lot of portraits painted by women, but they did have a lot of paintings of the presidents. Now, the presidents' portraits, the official ones, are sometimes a little bit intimidating. They're very severe often with a little American flag, and they don't tell you that much about the person's personality. So you really have this idea that the president is this sort of almost remote figure. So I just said, well, I'm going to do my own rendition of each person on the cards. Of course, at the time, there were only 42 presidents, so there were other characters in the deck too, and I painted a version of all of those as well. And at the end of this period of time, I'll have created my own version of the National Portrait Gallery. Of course, everybody dropped out of the group probably after about the third week because it's a lot of discipline. It ended up taking me 2 years to finish the entire show. And at that time, it was 1996 when I finished the presidents. And Al Gore had just come through California saying he wanted to have all the schools hooked to the internet. So I decided, well, I'm going to hold the first internet election where all the past presidents of the United States, myself included, I ran on the Joker ticket, I handed out bribes for a month in California, will run for president. I mean, what an interesting idea. Who would win if Jefferson was running against Washington? So I held the first internet election where all the past presidents ran. I got votes from Germany and Japan. The LA Times announced in my paper on Super Tuesday that I was in first place and Nixon was in second. And that was up for about a year. Then I went to various presidential museums where they hold their own elections. And so today you're going to be asked to vote. And the question I don't answer is whether you vote for your favorite painting or you vote for the accomplishments of the man that you most admire. Because that's how I liken it to the real elections. Do you vote for the person's achievements or background, or do you vote for the best picture that's painted of that person? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each one as I go along. At the end, you'll see a picture of Lou Hoover. When this show was finished in 1997, I moved to a very large studio in Arizona, and I decided to paint all the presidents' wives. Now, there's a difference between first ladies and wives, because you see an exhibit on first ladies, they're often the younger, more suitable substitutes, because the first lady was too physically, mentally, or emotionally, or plain just didn't want to serve. So in this case, I painted all the wives. I researched their stories. In 2 instances, there are no even images existing, Martha Jefferson and Margaret Taylor, of what the wife looked like. So it was very, very interesting. So that show will be done in probably the next couple months. And that's the paintings are very large. They couldn't fit them all here. They're from 5 feet to 15 feet, the wives. The presidents are much smaller. I had a smaller studio then. So each one of these paintings, the style and the style of the frame is meant to represent either something of the person's personality or the era in which the person served. So for example, and I'll just tell you a little bit about each one, George Washington is seen in a very deep box. It's lined in velvet. It's painted on clayboard, and it's meant to have that sense of an icon with the single nail. Now, the painting I did of Martha Washington, I blew up to huge proportions because these are much larger paintings. Did it very similar, but when you take the nail and blow it up to this large of a proportion, the nail takes on almost like a religious significance. And the story I already told Christine that heard these. I live in northern Arizona, and our area is probably 50% Native American. And one day I saw this family standing in front of the Martha Washington painting, and the woman said, the daughter said, "I had to bring my parents here. I saw the paintings yesterday and went and brought them back." And neither of the parents spoke English. They both spoke Hopi. And they're just fascinated by this painting. They want to know who this woman is, who's so important to deserve all this red. And I said, well, that's Martha Washington. And the reason why some people may not have recognized her is because I didn't put one of those in. When you think of Martha Washington, you think of that little bonnet on her head. Well, she didn't always wear that bonnet. And so I figured she probably didn't want to be painted in it all the time. So I did a younger version of Martha Washington. And this painting is John Adams, our second president. And he's pictured here on a seal. One of the things that rose him to prominence is that he fought the taxation without representation, that wanted to put a tax on paper products and such as things as playing cards. And he fought this, and had it passed, and he had not been successful, the seal, the British seal at the time, would have looked something like this. It would not have had Adam's face in the middle, but it would have looked like this. In his wife's painting, this seal now appears on her teapot next to a can of British tea. This is Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, and he is pictured here on the nickel. This is done on a cabinet door. And we have Monticello at the bottom, of course, which is the house that he designed. He was known as a great inventor. He did all these wild little contraptions and inventions, and one of them was a little machine that wrote frontwards and backwards. He's seen signing his name with a J, but that also stands for the Jack, because he's the Jack of Diamonds. And he, of course, has the pen in his hands for his famous signature.
How did you decide which is the Jack of Diamonds? Why that?
Okay, now those were chosen by the Smithsonian. When I pulled out the cards, say there was a portrait of Jefferson, it would be a traditional portrait of Jefferson, and the deck of cards had him as the Jack of Diamonds. So I did my own rendition, but I kept the Smithsonian's face value in suit. So whoever they had made the Jack of Diamonds, that's how I chose. Now, people ask, was it random? I don't think it was totally random. I mean, look here, George Washington is the ace of hearts. Lincoln is an ace. I mean, there was Kennedy, they made a king. So I think there was something going on, at least in someone's mind, the creators of the deck. But that's kind of fun to think about. But that wasn't what was in my mind. This is James Madison. And he's painted in oils on a wood background. And he is our fourth president. And he was a very small man. He was my height exactly, and without the shoes, high heels on. So he would have been a little smaller than me if we were standing next to each other. And he only weighed 100 pounds, so he was about 5 pounds lighter than me, too. So we could have wrestled, and I might have won. Dolly Madison is famous for when the White House was on fire. She was a very flamboyant woman, very quiet. Madison married. She's famous for going into the White House and saving the portrait of George Washington. And the way it's been blown up in history, you get this idea of this Dolly Madison with her turbans on, running into the White House, all in flames, grabbing this portrait. In reality, she probably went up something like this. Could somebody please take this portrait down? So I decided to do a takeoff on that, and I have her portrait, it's life-size. She's got all the turbans on, and she's running out of the White House. I mean, it's just engulfed in flames. I mean, they're licking her heels. And instead of carrying the portrait of George Washington, she's carrying this exact painting. I painted a reproduction of it under her arm. So she's saving my painting of her husband. And so when I do the wives and the husbands, the paintings often reappear, and which is really fun. And that's what happens in the portrait of here of Adams. He reappears in his wife's portrait. This is James Monroe, and if you get a chance to look very closely in this painting, in the eyes are a 3 and a diamond that look almost like the flashbulb reflections of a camera. He was very much a dandy. He liked to dress. He was a handsome man, as you can see here with his ascot on. And that's James Monroe, most known for the Monroe Doctrine. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. And he was a skinny dipper in the Potomac until he was in his late 70s. And people say, well, why if he's a skinny dipper, Tina, why is he having a bathing suit? Well, these portraits, remember, have gone through several presidential libraries. So we do have to keep it G-rated. And so this is John Adams. And actually, I spoke today on the radio about his election, which I think is very timely because John Adams was running against Jackson, Andrew Jackson, and there were two other people running at the time. There was Crawford and Clay. John Adams lost the popular and the electoral vote. None of them had a majority to win, but Jackson won the popular and the electoral vote. It went to the House of Representatives. Clay said, strike the deal with Adams. He said, I'll throw my support to you if you make me Secretary of State. And he said, okay. So he made him Secretary of State. His support was thrown to John Quincy Adams, and that's how we got John Quincy Adams as our president. Now this was very controversial, and it made his presidency extremely tough for 4 years. He had a hard time. Jackson came back in the next election and won with an overwhelming majority. Both of them ended up being good presidents. They both did a lot of good for the country. John Adams fought very hard against slavery and against the gag rule at the time where no one was supposed to even mention slavery. But let's just say they weren't on friendly terms with one another. And this is, some of these are reproductions because the originals might be in a collection and it was too difficult to get it at this time. But this is Andrew Jackson, the Seven of Hearts. And he was a very flamboyant man. And he had a wife that he was very much in love with. He actually killed a man in a duel for insulting his wife. He was shot first, and then he ended up firing back. But his wife, Rachel, when he was elected for the presidency, said, I'll never live in the White House. Well, there are some stories that have her dying while she was packing her suitcase. What we do know is that she died right around the time she was supposed to move into the White House. She was attacked so horribly. She was attacked for her weight. She was attacked because her divorce with her husband hadn't become final. When she married Jackson, though she believed it had been, he kept one paper. He kept one paper to himself and didn't file it. So they had to be remarried a second time, so people called him a bigamist. And so he went into the White House very upset about this. And so that's why he's got this very stern, sort of concerned look on his face. And this is Martin Van Buren. And everybody says, well, why is he so green? And he has this big sort of bulbous head with orange hair. Well, when I was painting it, I kept saying, Martian Van Buren. Martian Van Buren. And I think if I say something, it starts coming out that way. And he ended up he looks like a Martian, too. If you look really in the old photographs and stuff. He was a Dutch man. He spoke Dutch at home. And that was Martin Van Buren, our 8th president. This is William Henry Harrison, and he has a little watercolor here. He served as our shortest term as president, only 32 days. And this was definitely a lesson for those who were going to write long inauguration speeches, because he wrote a long inauguration speech. He didn't wear his hat. It was a cold day, caught cold and died. But he left us with something very important. He left us with a way and a style of doing campaigns. He had one of the most lively campaigns of all time. You know, some of you may remember the slogan, you won't remember, but you may have heard the slogan, tip a canoe and tile it too. There were log cabins that he had on stakes marching through parades, over 100 campaign songs. And he made large leather balls with slogans on them that were rolled by several men down the street. Remember those leather balls because they come back later. And I won't tell you that, but just remember that, large leather balls. Okay. Now this is John Tyler, and he was our 10th president. He was the first president to marry while president, and also the first to have a child born in the White House. And he had a lot of children born. He had 15 children, 14 lived to adulthood. He had 2 wives. Both of them served as First Lady in the White House because he was married the second time he lost one. And that's John Tyler. Okay. Now this is James Polk, and he's painted as a man on a horse, which the painting can be seen right side up or upside down. When he was running for president, it could be reversed because he was the first dark horse candidate to win the election. So when he won, it got turned around this way. And he, of course, was known for Manifest Destination. He wanted to have the United States stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He was an avid horseman, and he was very formal, though, in his dress. So this is how I pictured he might have looked riding his horse back in his days. Now this man here is Zachary Taylor. And he's pictured in this very ornate frame. Zachary Taylor said that he was anti-slavery, but then kept over 100 slaves. And I've pictured what his painting might have looked like in a big plantation home. So that's why he's very, serious, and the painting's frame is very ornate. And so this is Zachary Taylor, and he's the 10 of clubs, which you can see painted here in the corners. Now his wife was very interesting to paint because nobody knows what she looked like. It's pretty amazing, since she lived in the White House. People questioned her existence. Some people called her the Phantom of the White House. Some people said, oh, she's probably they're so backwards, that down south they probably keep her hidden because she's embarrassed. None of that was true. She just did not want to be a public figure. So when I did her portraits, since there's no sketches or anything of Margaret, I had her turning away from the canvas, and I made her look like me. I figured, well, she could look like anyone. She could look like me. So if you want to know what Margaret Taylor looked like, hi. Now, this is Millard Fillmore, and Millard Fillmore has a fan club in the United States. He was our 13th president, and he's painted here sort of as a sketchy character. He's sort of in a sketch style. And of course, usually somebody will come up and ask me why there's a stem on his head. You see real close? I couldn't resist. I painted, I drew it, and I said, boy, he looks like a pumpkin, but he needs a stem. So I put the stem on there for that very important historical reason. This is Franklin Pierce, and I was in Japan right about the time I was in the middle of doing the presidents, and some friends of mine who are Japanese said, have you done anyone in a Japanese style? I said, not yet. And then we did some research, and Millard Fillmore sent Admiral Perry to Japan, but the treaty with Japan, and which was a major thing at the time because Japan was a closed kingdom, wasn't signed until Franklin Pierce's term as president. So he's holding here, this is a watercolor, he's holding the treaty with Japan. And he's painted as a shogun. He's holding a pen in one of his hands. This here is James Buchanan, and most people recognize the body as that of a doughboy, that little character that pops out of the dough. And that's because he was the last of the dough faces. That's a person that speaks one way about slavery but votes another. Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan were all dough faces. And he also had very tiny feet and a large body, very much like a Pillsbury doughboy. And it caused him, and he also had this condition known as wry neck, where his neck was always to one side because one eye was nearsighted and one was farsighted. And so if you were to see him, he walked something like this, which could explain why he never married. Now this is Abraham Lincoln, and it's called Fate. There are two curtains on either side. They symbolize the theater. And he's painted on a slot machine to symbolize that he didn't even want to go to the theater that night. Grant was supposed to go. He decided not to go at the last minute. And Lincoln didn't want to let the public down. This was his personality was just to do it anyway, to show up. And it was just a horrible bunch of circumstances that had him at the theater that night. And so I have the ace here and the clubs, and that can also stand for ace, for Abraham Lincoln. Of course, there's the derringer pointing to the back of his head. And it's just sort of fate that everything fell into place that night, and he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. So that's Abraham Lincoln. And it threw this man, Andrew Johnson, into a blinding spotlight. Can you imagine all of a sudden, I mean, the end of the Civil War, the most tumultuous time in the United States history, and all of a sudden you're president at a time when you're trying to bring the country together, try to begin some healing, which is a very difficult thing to do after this incredibly bloody war. And so he was impeached. The vote, he failed by one vote from being impeached. But in his portrait I have with his wife, I have them sitting at a table on the eve of their impeachment, and she just wants to go back to Tennessee. She did not want to be the wife of the president. She'd just seen what happened to Abraham Lincoln. And he stuck with it. He actually came back as a senator, which is very interesting, after his term of president. He only served for 3 months, and then he died. But at least he did come back. His clothing are painted very detailed, and I took a lot of care in that because Andrew Johnson was a tailor, and he also was an indentured servant. And he actually ran away from his indentured servitude to a tailor, and there was advertisements put in the newspaper, $10 reward for the return of Andrew Johnson. In fact, Millard Fillmore was also an indentured servant, and he bought his freedom for $30. So it's amazing to think that a president would be in that position. But he was a very poor man from humble means. And in fact, his wife taught him to read and write. This is, I think, one of the saddest paintings in the show. And I spoke about this earlier. This is Ulysses Grant. And he was, of course, the famous general from the Union. But he was also a very sensitive man. He didn't like any swearing around him, any off-colored jokes. He was very sensitive about being seen naked. He couldn't eat rare meat. He killed 2 animals in his lifetime, and it's something he ended up saying that he regretted his whole life, that he killed 2 wild animals. So on one side he was this very formidable general. On the other side he was this very sensitive man. And he was very concerned that he was going to leave his wife penniless because he wasn't the best businessman. So he decided to write his memoirs of the Civil War. He smoked 20 cigars a day, and he had throat cancer. So he spent the last years of his life huddled over a little table in pain, quite a bit of pain if you've seen any pictures of him at that time, writing. And I imagined what he would look like reading over his life. He has just finished his book, and he realizes he's at the end of his life and the end of his story. He died 3 days after finishing his memoirs. And the 7 of clubs makes the shadow of death. And the gray around the painting symbolizes that feeling of loneliness and solitude you might feel if you realize you've reached the end of your life. And he's sort of hiding behind this curtain, polling booth curtain. And he has his hand over the ballot box. He lost the popular and the electoral vote for election. Tilden lost the electoral vote. He was one electoral vote shy of being president. And Hayes went on to become president because it was thrown to a bipartisan committee. An independent dropped out, a Republican was put in, and they voted for Hayes. So that was also a very disputed election. And at the time, I wrote on my text here, and remember this text was written a while ago, this was the most disputed election in history. I have to go back and update everything. So now this is James Garfield, and he's seen in this round shape, which is sort of like the barrel of a gun. And this is because Garfield was assassinated. A disgruntled office seeker put a gun up to his head, and his head, his chest, it said, "Now Arthur's president," and shot him. So it was very, very upset. He lingered for a while, and his wife took care of him for many weeks, and it was a very sad story. He was, of course, very famous being from Ohio. Also, Hayes was from Ohio, and Grant. They were all Confederate generals from Ohio. This is Garfield, and he's looking very somber and sad. He's got big, huge whiskers. I think that's really great. And he's rising over Garfield's grave. He's become president when Garfield was assassinated, and this haunted him. He was a sensitive man, and this very much haunted him. He had just lost his wife shortly before he became vice president, so he was terribly upset by these two events. He placed fresh flowers in front of his wife's portrait every day that he was in the White House. He was an honest man. He was a good man. His party at the time, unfortunately, was corrupt and turned against him and did not renominate him for election. So he died less than 2 years out of office, a broken man. So he has this very sad look. The frame was chosen because it resembles what I imagine might be hanging as a memorial in a funeral parlor. And the very plum color here is just, I think, a very sad, somber color to go with his painting. But on a happier note, sort of more sparkly sort of rendition, we have Grover Cleveland here with his very young wife. She was 21 years old when she married Grover, who was 49. She was the daughter of his law partner, and when her father died, Grover sort of took over as a father figure. So there were a lot of rumors. It caused a lot of scandal at that time because of their age difference, and there were people that claimed that he kept her locked in the White House. Well, if you see my portrait of her, which is very, very large, she's holding this little marionette puppet, and the marionette puppet's Grover. She knew much more what she was doing than anybody gave her credit for, and that came clear at the end of 4 years when she said, "I'll be back." Grover Cleveland won the popular vote 3 elections in a row. He lost the electoral vote in his second election to Harrison, but came back again, the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. And so she came back triumphantly 4 years later after no longer being First Lady. She came back and served it again. She was a very popular First Lady. They're a very popular couple. And she was also the First Lady to remarry. She went on to have after the president. There's only been two presidents' wives that remarried after the death of the president, and that was Kennedy and Cleveland. Remember those big leather balls I said to not forget? Well, they're back again. And this is now the grandson. He learned a lot of lessons from his grandfather. One, he learned, ooh, those big leather balls work, so let's push them down the streets again. And that's how we have the slogan, keep the ball rolling. He also learned to keep your inauguration speech short and wear a hat. So, so he had a longer term as president. This is William McKinley. William McKinley caused a lot of grief for American husbands at the time because he set the standard so high. He cared for his wife enormously. His wife, Ida, they had 2 children. She'd lost them both when they were very young. And she had also lost her mother around the same time. Nobody knows exactly what was wrong with her. She suffered from a lot of medical problems, including epileptic seizures. And he broke White House protocol by, at the time, having his wife sit next to him. And she would sometimes make a hissing sound and become stiff, and he would know that a seizure was coming on. He would take his napkin at a state dinner, put it over her face. The seizure would be over. He'd say nothing, put it down as if nothing happened. He would keep her beside him at important meetings, and he would occasionally just get up in the middle of the meeting and go and adjust her shawl. So he cared very much for his wife, which made it even more sad, I think, and tragic when he was assassinated. His first words were to his secretary after being shot, "Be careful how you tell Ida." So you can imagine she lived for several years after he died, and the pain that she must have had to go through. I mean, she lost all her children and now her husband. So it was very, very tragic. This is Theodore Roosevelt. Now we're back to sort of a very happy story. And he was a very flamboyant character. I think I would have liked him a lot had I ever had a chance to meet him. He was the first president to ride an automobile, fly an airplane, be submerged in a submarine. He was the first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. We had 1 Nobel Peace Prizes. Wilson also won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so he was a man of many firsts and a very, very flamboyant character and lively. a lively president. So I painted him very colorful, and the many sides of the happy smiling. Everybody remembers him with these big teeth, and campaign teeth you could buy at those days when he was running. Wonderful things that the theater's face on them. Of course, he also brought us the word teddy bear, and so that's Theodore. Now, actually, this man here, Howard Taft, was our largest president. He weighed in at 360 pounds. Grover Cleveland weighed in at 260 pounds, or about 340, 260, give or take, 20, 40, 50 pounds. And Grover Cleveland had a wonderful story. When he was campaigning, or when he was president, he was going through one of these small towns, and an old man came up to him and said, I have voted for a lot of presidents, but I've never seen a president in real life. And he said, well, what do you think? And the man said, you're a whopper. An even bigger whopper to come along was William Taft, and a huge, huge mustache on him. And I'm particularly fond of William Taft because when I laid out those cards and I pulled one to start this whole process, which would last me years, his was the first card that I chose. I was blindfolded. And I'm so glad that it was such a colorful and fun character to paint, because it got me all excited. I did Taft and said, well, look at this. I'm going to do all the presidents. At the time, I wasn't sure. I didn't know I was going to do all the wives, too. But he started the whole ball rolling for me, that man right there. And then this is Woodrow Wilson, who was president of Princeton University. And I tried to frame it in a way that I pictured the painting hanging behind his desk at the university. He was also married in the White House, or not married in the White House, but married as president. It was a very small ceremony. They wanted to keep it quiet because he had two wives, and Edith and Ellen, and his first wife died in the White House. So he was married as president. Grover Cleveland was married as president. And Tyler was married as president. And nobody has done it since, but I think it would be kind of fun, don't you? So it was, the newspapers just had a heyday with it. I mean, they loved it. And of course, he had a stroke, and his wife, as I was saying earlier, Ellen, decided who would see him, or what matters were important enough to bring up to the president. This caused a lot of people, a lot of Republicans at the time got very upset and called it the petticoat campaign, not campaign, I forget what I'm saying now. But so he died. She actually never recovered from a stroke, and he died after. She's just going further and further downhill. If you see pictures of him towards the end of his presidency, he's carrying a cane.
What's the significance of the red dot in his forehead?
Well, the red dot is the king of diamonds, but it can also be seen as a symbol for his racism. He was a great president. He did a lot of wonderful things, but he had this one very backwards, horrible view, and that he did believe, a little bit like Polk believed, in certain people being born to their station, and he believed that he was born president as almost he was ordained president, and you were born to your station, and you were born to your station, and so that's why that's there. It's sort of a subliminal reference to that.
All of your other portraits have the principal centered in the frame. That one is not. Is there any significance to that?
No, no.
The green background?
No, it's sort of a conservative color, sort of modest color. Of course, you see Teddy Roosevelt in these wild colors, because his personality was much quieter, and Teddy Roosevelt's was so exuberant that the colors of the presidents and the way I painted them, like when you get to Gerald Ford or you get to Calvin Coolidge, they're more quiet colors around them. It has to do with and of course then you have LBJ, who's very flamboyant colors. It has to do with their personality. Were they a quiet man like Calvin Coolidge? He has a little tweed around him, or a very colorful, loud kind of person like LBJ, that dictated a lot as far as the colors go. So that's why he has a somber color. And he had a lot of sadness in his life as well. I mean, he fought very hard as president to get the League of Nations going, and it never really took off the way he wanted it to. So that was a very big disappointment in his life. He did get nominated for Nobel Peace Prize because of his work in the League of Nations.
Did your first paintings really get painted in a week's time?
It took 2 years to finish because sometimes I would come up with another idea, like the one I told you of Franklin Pierce. I had already had another Franklin Pierce, and then I went to Japan and said, oh, I've got to do it as a Japanese style. So sometimes in light of new information or reading, I would get another idea that I would want to do. So it ended up taking 2 years to finish the whole show. So probably about 2 weeks per painting. But I still kept with the Sunday, every Sunday blindfolding myself. Now this character is one of my favorites. I mean, historians rate him the bottom as presidents, but storytellers would have to rate him up there at the top because I mean, this guy is just a fountain of fabulous stories. Florence and Warren Harding were traveling out west when he took suddenly ill, and he died a couple days later. And Florence said no autopsy on his body, which made many people think she poisoned him. She raced back to Washington, imagine this happening today, and she started burning the White House papers. There were so many scandals. In her portrait, there's the teapot under a dome for the Teapot Dome scandal. There's his shoes, very nice shoes sticking out from underneath of the table. This same bow tie is appearing by itself next to a bottle of poison. His death set off suicides and scandals throughout Washington. And his doctor that was attending him at the time also died shortly later, and his wife died less than 2 years later. So all the secrets and everything that everybody was questioning really were all buried within a 2-year span. So nobody really knows for sure what happened and all the secrets surrounding Warren Harding. He did some wild things. He gambled away an entire set of White House china. He was a gambler. He had a pile of girlfriends. His wife said, Florence said, I hate moving to Washington. Everybody wants my husband. He was a handsome man, and he was, I don't think he was a bad man, though. He came out a lot for civil rights, I mean, way before anybody else did at this time. And I don't think he was bad. I just think he couldn't say no to anybody. He said, it's not my enemies that cause me problems, it's my friends. Yeah. I don't even think he wanted to be president. If Florence really wanted to be First Lady. And this is Calvin Coolidge. And like I said, this one's very soft colors in the frame and very tweed to go with his quietness. He was a man of few words. When someone came up to his wife and said, I get to sit next to your husband at dinner tonight, she said, I'm sorry. And there were lots of jokes between them about this. And so I really loved the slogan, keep cool with Coolidge. So that's why it says keep Coolidge. And he's seen here blowing away with a big fan. He went into the White House. Actually, there was a terrible tragedy that happened shortly after he became president, and that is that his son, his teenage son, was playing tennis, and he got a slight cut on his foot. It got infected, and he died. And so you think of the presidency as these people that, oh, you could keep anything bad from happening to them, but this isn't that long ago. This is 1923 when he became president. And still, we had children dying of something as simple as an infection on their foot. This man over here, though, by the way, was the first man whose wife could have voted for him for president. I always like that. We don't know if she did. She also is the first that could have actually murdered her husband. So. And this is Herbert Hoovering. And he's hoovering over Europe. And I put him in his miner's hat to indicate that he was a great engineer, a very brilliant man and a wonderful engineer. Columbia University voted him and Thomas Edison as being the two greatest American engineers of all time. He's wearing clothing very typical of the era. The frame is very Art Deco, and it's supposed to symbolize the whole feeling of the 1930s. And he's floating over Europe to symbolize his work with the American Relief Fund to feed the hungry in Europe, all the work he did feeding thousands of people. His wife did a lot of work in teaching the deaf to read, to speak. She's taught sign language. And he said something, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but my wife teaches the people that are deaf to speak. I wonder if she can teach the mute to speak. Oh. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he's painted, this is a reproduction of the painting, which is a pastel. He's painted 4 times, and in each one he's growing progressively older. It symbolizes his 4 terms in office, and he's smoking his famous cigarette in the holder, and it's growing smaller and smaller, and in the final one it's just ashes and it's gone out. And that symbolizes his 4 terms in office and that he died in his 4th term. He's painted in a way that looks like a movie still. And that's because he was the first president to appear on TV. It's also painted in black and white because he was, of course, TV was black and white back there in those days. And I think he kind of got progressively handsomer as he aged. He became very distinguished. And I like to say I have several girlfriends that have come up to me and asked if I can do this to them, make them look older so they can see what they're going to look like. But that's very treacherous territory to go into. This is Harry S. Truman, and the story with Truman is that I didn't know what to do when I went to do his painting. I just hit a roadblock. I thought, oh, I could do the whistle stops, I could put it on the back of a train, and I want to do something that really symbolizes the era. So I got these old magazines from his time in office and started going through them, and I came upon an advertisement for a pink Cadillac. It was a bright pink Cadillac, all twinkly, floating in a blue sky with stars all in the background. I said, that's it, right there, that's Truman. He was the Cadillac of his time. So I painted him all sparkly and pink and put him in a blue sky, and then I framed him, and I think this is a wonderful frame, which is very reminiscent, I went to his home in Independence, of the type of frame, very modest frame, that you could see hanging in a home at that time. To me, it symbolizes sort of that era. And so that's Harry S. Truman. Eisenhower has a woman in his painting. Eisenhower did a very brilliant thing. Eisenhower took the woman's vote seriously. Women got the right to vote in 1920. They could have voted for Harding, but women didn't come out to vote. They got the right to vote. Many said, I don't want to do this. They didn't vote. And if they did vote, they always voted usually in the way that their husband voted. Well, Eisenhower changed all that forever. Eisenhower geared his whole campaign towards the American housewife. He had, let's sweep up America, and he had paper bags and brooms. Let's mop out the White House. Here's my shopping list of what we're going to do. Be a party girl, which was a double entendre for joining the Republican Party. And he also geared his campaign for bringing our boys back from the war. Everything that he did was geared towards appealing to the American housewife. From the stockings that they had, the I Like Ike stockings, and same thing with Mamie. Mamie was a very popular figure back then. She really loved being in the spotlight. There were Mamie tape dispensers. There were Ike telephones. I mean, just wildly wild things if you think about it. And Mamie songs. There were I Like Mamie songs playing on the radio. And so that's why we have an American housewife here holding up his picture. And he won on the woman's vote. In the portrait I have of Mamie, it symbolizes a lot of what was going on in the 1950s. And I have a husband and a wife one another. And the wife is holding behind her husband's back, where only the viewer can see, a button that says, "I like Ike," and the husband's holding an Adelai button on the other side. So this is JFK. And the idea for this painting came from the fact that we had had this was our fourth assassination. We had had four presidents assassinated, 3 were assassinated before we had anything like movies. I mean, this was filmed, which totally changed the way we viewed an assassination. In the 1940s, a man named William Egerton invented something called stereoscopic photography, where you used a strobe light to stop action photography. He did a famous photograph of a bullet going through a card, and he did a famous photograph of a drop of milk falling. I started thinking, well, that was stop-action photography. This is stop-action assassination. So that's what sort of was the genesis for this idea. In a deck of cards, the King of Hearts is called the Suicide King. If you look closely next time you're playing cards, the King of Hearts has a sword going through his head. People called Kennedy suicidal for going out in his limousine without the bulletproof glass on. If you look in this painting very closely, there are 2 swords entering Kennedy, one from another direction, as for the conspiracy theory that there were 2 bullets that came from different directions. The ermine cape represents, it was sort of the shape of tears, represents the tears that the country shed at the time. And so that one's called Stop Action Assassination. And here we have the wrinkly Texan, LBJ, for the USA. This painting is this is a reproduction of the painting, which actually has burlap around it in a very hand-carved frame, symbolizing Texan and all things large in America, and American. So that was a real lot of fun. And this is LBJ, who fought very hard for civil rights, and his wife fought for the beautification of American highways. So in her portrait, there's a big painting of a highway sign, interstate sign, and she appears in the same bandana, except this time it's pink. And it says, "All the way with LBJ," which is interesting since her initials were the same, Lady Bird Johnson. And this is the, when you said about, somebody asked about the size of the painting, this is the smallest one in the show, but definitely not the least important. This one is painted as a Rorschach test, so that people can make their own determination. And a story I told earlier, but one that I really like, is after the show first appeared in the newspaper, the LA Times, I got a call from the Nixon Library. And they were very excited. Oh, Nixon's name's in the newspaper, and they wanted to know all about the paintings. And they called 2 weeks later, a little bit more serious, and they said the board of directors had had a meeting, and they were concerned why I had made Nixon the ace of spades. Could I explain this? And I said, well, you should go to the Smithsonian and ask them that question, since they determined the face value and suit of the cards. But I wouldn't be too concerned about it if I were you, because the ace of spades can be the highest or the lowest card in a deck of cards. And since I painted him as a Rorschach test, I left it for people's own determination. Well, they loved that answer and sent me a book on Pat. So that's really for everybody's determination to make. And it's, of course, always changing. And the feelings about presidents always change. Like Truman ended up not being a very popular president. He's been very popular in my elections ever since. I mean, his popularity has just soared after his presidency. Now this is Gerald Ford, and he's seen balancing the 6 of hearts on his shoulders. And that's to symbolize a very difficult job that was thrown in his lap of trying to keep the country calm, trying to bring some peace and dignity back to the presidency after the huge upset of the Watergate trials. So he had an enormous job. So that's the blonde Leslie King. His name was Leslie King. He changed it to Gerald Ford after his adopted father. He didn't meet his father until he was 17 years old. And over here is his good friend, Jimmy Carter. The two still continue to be close friends. And Jimmy Carter is seen painted as a stained glass window. Now this is a reproduction of the painting. This is to symbolize that he was a very spiritual man. Both he and Rosalind. The spade can symbolize the 9 of spades, or it can also be a Habitat for Humanity trawl to show his work building houses after the presidency. The presidency has been really redefined. I think he's helped redefine the presidency after the presidency by going on and doing a nonstop work after his term. He was a very religious man, so his hand is here on a Bible. He and Rosalind read the Bible in bed every day. And this is quite a feat if you imagine that Jimmy Carter was clocked at reading 2,000 words per minute with a 98% comprehension. 2,000 words per minute. So you can imagine how many times he's read the Bible. I mean, I can't even calculate. You need a computer to do that. So that's Jimmy. And here we have Ronald Reagan, and he's painted in a style of pastel on pastel board. And it's sort of a sad painting. It shows him sort of very charismatic, smiling face, but it's sort of fading a little bit on the edges, symbolizing his beginning of his descent into Alzheimer's. So that's the very charismatic Ronald Reagan. And here's finally, 2 more left. We have George Bush, seen waving here, possibly to his son, I don't know. But he lived just right across the water from where I lived. I actually could see his house when I lived in Maine. And I saw his helicopter a lot, his limousine, but I actually never saw him waving at me like this. But that's how I painted him. And here we finally have, and this is a reproduction of the pastel. The pastel has a very modest frame around it to show that Clinton came from a very humble background. He didn't have a lot of privileges growing up. He grew up without a father. And so the frame is something you might find in a thrift store. It's very modest. And he's seen here in a pastel, all pink, being pulled out of a hat. And that symbolizes his incredible ability to get himself out of almost any kind of trouble. So that's Bill Clinton. And then over here we have Lou Hoover, and this is the new series that I've started of all the wives. Well, just about finished. I only have 3 wives left to complete. And these are large paintings. And what I do is I read a lot about the First Lady, and then I make up a story and try to put myself in her shoes. So the story about Lou is that it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She's gone into her kitchen and she's made herself a cup of jasmine tea. She's walked out on her porch, and the aroma of the tea and the sound of the singing birds has transported her back in her memory. This is really a painting of a woman's memory to her life in China. She and Herbert Hoover lived there right at the time of the Boxer Revolution. So she's thinking back at this time. She was a brilliant, brilliant woman. She spoke several languages, including teaching herself fluent Chinese to the point where she could transcribe texts. She and Herbert would actually speak to each other in the White House in Chinese if they didn't want anyone to understand her, though she was definitely the best of the two as far as speaking. In fact, she's laughing to herself in this painting, remembering how difficult it was to try to teach Herbert Chinese. So everything in the painting has been transformed by her memory, except for the dog and Lou. The background looks very Chinese. My name now appears on a Chinese theater ticket. She collected porcelains, and I imagine there might have been one on the porch, but her memory has transformed the figure on the horse into Herbert Hoover, her hero. So he's seen there riding the horse, and she's lost in her memory. And that's it. That's the final. Now, if I would like everybody to go and vote. Vote for your favorite president or your favorite painting, and we'll see who wins here at Herbert Hoover Presidential Museum.